My father paid him to protect me from other men, but no amount would stop him from falling for me. The moment Nolan realized he'd rather lose everything than lose her, he knew Richard Kingsley's money couldn't buy what he'd already given away for free: his heart. He could still feel the way his hands had trembled that evening in her art studio, watching paint-stained fingers create something beautiful while he wrestled with the most dangerous mission of his career. Not dangerous because of bullets or explosions, he'd faced those. Dangerous because every day he spent protecting Layla Kingsley, he was falling deeper into territory no amount of military training had prepared him for. The scent of turpentine and oils filled the converted warehouse space, but all he could focus on was the way she moved, fluid, passionate, completely unaware that her bodyguard was fighting a losing battle against his own heart. When she finally looked up from her canvas, those dark eyes holding his with an intensity that made his breath catch, he knew he was about to betray everything he stood for. The job was supposed to be simple, he whispered, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain professional distance. Keep you safe, keep you alive. Nobody mentioned keeping my heart intact. Her paintbrush trembled in her grip, a drop of crimson falling to the floor between them like a small wound. Nolan ... Have you ever been paid to walk away from the one thing that made you feel alive? Because standing there, watching her lips part as if she wanted to say something that would change everything, he understood that some prices are too high to pay, even when honor demands it. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. But let him take you back to where it all began, 3 months earlier, when he walked into Richard Kingsley's marble-columned office, believing he was just taking another protection assignment. He had no idea he was about to meet the woman who would make him question everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the dangerous territory between love and loyalty. Richard Kingsley commanded attention the moment you entered his presence. Silver-haired, sharp-suited, with the kind of confidence that came from building an empire from nothing, he stood behind a mahogany desk the size of Nolan's first apartment. But it wasn't his wealth that impressed the bodyguard. It was the genuine fear he saw in the older man's eyes when he spoke about his daughter. Mr. Prescott, Richard began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd spent sleepless nights worrying. I need someone who understands that my daughter's safety isn't just a job, it's everything. She's all I have left since her mother passed. Nolan had seen that look before, in the eyes of civilians whose worlds had been shattered by violence. It was the look of a man who'd learned that money couldn't buy the one thing that mattered most: peace of mind. Tell me about the threat, Nolan said, settling into the leather chair across from him, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. Scott Hill. The name left Richard's lips like something bitter. Wealthy, entitled, and completely unable to accept that my daughter isn't interested. What started as persistent pursuit has escalated into something much more dangerous. Following her, showing up at her workplace, making threats about what he'll do if she doesn't give him a chance. Richard pulled out a file thick with photographs, police reports, and restraining orders that had proven worthless against a man with enough money to make problems disappear. Nolan's jaw tightened as he scanned the evidence. This wasn't just unwanted attention. It was systematic stalking with escalating aggression. Layla doesn't know the full extent of it, Richard continued, his hands clasping and unclasping as he spoke. She thinks it's just an overzealous admirer. I've kept the worst incidents from her because she's already fighting me on accepting protection. She values her independence above everything else. Nolan understood immediately. Daughters of powerful men often struggled with the gilded cage that came with their father's protection. They craved normal lives, authentic relationships, the freedom to make their own mistakes. But sometimes the world didn't allow for such luxuries. What are you looking for in terms of protection detail? Nolan asked. Complete, 24-hour coverage. She works at the Morrison Gallery downtown, has her own art studio in the warehouse district, maintains an active social life. I need someone who can blend in, keep her safe without making her feel like a prisoner." Richard's eyes met his directly. "I need someone I can trust, absolutely." The compensation he offered was more than generous, enough to set Nolan up for years, maybe even fund his own security consulting firm. It should have been an easy decision, but something in Richard's tone made him pause. "Mr. Kingsley, I need you to understand something. My job is to protect your daughter, not to control her. If she wants to go somewhere, do something, see someone. As long as I can ensure her safety, she has that right." A slight smile crossed Richard's face, the first Nolan had seen since entering his office. "That's exactly why I chose you, Mr. Prescott. Layla will fight anyone who tries to cage her, but she might just respect someone who understands her need for freedom." An hour later, Nolan was walking through the Morrison Gallery, studying sight lines and exit routes, when he saw her for the first time. Layla Kingsley stood before a massive abstract painting, gesturing animatedly to a small group of visitors, her voice carrying the kind of passion that made you want to stop and listen even if art wasn't your thing. She was beautiful, but not in the polished, carefully constructed way he'd expected from a wealthy man's daughter. Her beauty was natural, vibrant, dark skin that seemed to glow under the gallery's soft lighting, hair that moved like silk when she turned her head, and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and fire. She wore a simple black dress that suggested sophistication without trying too hard, and when she laughed at something one of the visitors said, the sound drew the attention of everyone in the room. But it was the way she moved that caught his attention. Confident, graceful, like someone who knew exactly who she was and didn't apologize for it. This wasn't a sheltered princess hiding behind daddy's money. This was a woman who'd carved out her own space in the world. Nolan was studying the gallery's security weaknesses when their eyes met across the room. The visitor group had moved on, and she was alone with the painting again. But now she was looking directly at him with undisguised curiosity. For a moment, he forgot about sight lines and exit strategies. For a moment, he forgot about everything except the way her gaze seemed to see straight through him. Then, his phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "She's expecting you at 5. Office is in the back." Professional distance, he reminded himself. This was a job, nothing more. Layla's office was smaller than he'd expected, filled with art books, color swatches, and half-finished sketches tacked to every available wall surface. She sat behind a desk covered in organized chaos, and when he knocked on her open door, she looked up with an expression that was equal parts resignation and defiance. "You must be the babysitter," she said, setting down her pen with deliberate precision. "Bodyguard," he corrected gently, stepping into her space. "Nolan Prescott." When he extended his hand for a professional handshake, he wasn't prepared for the jolt of awareness that shot through him the moment their skin touched. Her hand was small in his, artist soft, but with calluses from gripping brushes and sculpting tools. But it was the way her eyes widened slightly, as if she'd felt it too, that made him hold on just a fraction longer than necessary. "Right," she said, pulling her hand back and tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture that somehow made her seem more real, more approachable. Dad explained the situation. Well, his version of it anyway. He settled into the chair across from her desk, noting how she straightened in response to his presence, not intimidated, but alert, assessing. "What's your version?" Her eyebrows rose, clearly not expecting the question. "Honestly, I think my father is overreacting to what amounts to an obnoxious admirer who doesn't understand the word, number. But apparently, I don't get a vote in whether I need protection." "You always have a vote," Nolan said, meaning it. "My job is to keep you safe, not to control your life. If you want to go somewhere, do something, see someone. We'll figure out how to make it work safely." Something shifted in her expression, suspicion giving way to curiosity. "And if I want to tell you to leave me alone, then I'll explain why that's not an option right now, and we'll negotiate a compromise that gives you as much freedom as possible while keeping you alive." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those intelligent eyes. "You're not what I expected." "What were you expecting?" "Some muscle-bound ex-cop who'd grunt one-word answers and follow me around like a trained gorilla." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Dad usually doesn't hire people who use words like negotiate and compromise. Nolan found himself smiling back, which should have been his first warning that this assignment was going to be different. I'm not most people. No, she said quietly, her gaze holding his with an intensity that made something warm unfold in his chest. I can see that. They spent the next hour going over her schedule, her routines, the places she frequented. She was methodical, practical, asking intelligent questions about security protocols without complaining about the restrictions they might impose. But underneath her cooperation, he sensed a vibrant spirit that chafed against any form of containment. I have one non-negotiable, she said as they wrapped up the meeting. What's that? My studio. It's where I do my real work, my personal art. It's, she paused, choosing her words carefully, sacred space. I won't have it violated by this situation. The passion in her voice when she spoke about her art sent an unexpected jolt through him. This wasn't just a hobby or a way to fill time. This was her soul's expression, the thing that made her who she was. Then we'll make sure it stays that way, he promised. When she smiled, really smiled, not the polite version she'd been wearing like armor, he felt something shift in his chest. Something that had nothing to do with professional duty and everything to do with the woman sitting across from him, paint stains on her fingers and fire in her eyes. He should have recognized the danger then, should have requested a transfer, recommended another operative, done anything except what he did, which was tell himself he could handle it, that he was professional enough, disciplined enough, controlled enough to protect her without letting his personal feelings complicate things. He'd never been more wrong about anything in his life. Chapter 2. The first sign that Nolan's carefully constructed professional boundaries were crumbling came 3 days into the assignment, during what should have been a routine security briefing. I need to show you some basic self-defense techniques, he told Layla as they stood in her apartment's spacious living room, afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Just in case we get separated in an emergency. She nodded, setting aside the art catalog she'd been reviewing. Makes sense. What do I need to know? Basic escape moves, how to break free if someone grabs you. He moved closer, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume, something warm and exotic that made it harder to concentrate on the task at hand. The most important thing is not to panic. Use your attacker's momentum against them. Show me, she said simply. That's when he made his first tactical error. Instead of demonstrating on a training dummy or describing the techniques verbally, he stepped behind her, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. If someone grabs you from behind like this, he said, placing his hands lightly on her shoulders to demonstrate the hold, don't try to pull away. That's what they expect. The moment his hands made contact, he felt her breath catch. Not from fear, from the same electric awareness that was currently short-circuiting his nervous system. Her body fit against his like it was designed to be there, and when she tilted her head slightly to listen to his instructions, her hair brushed against his jaw. Instead, he continued, his voice rougher than it should have been, you're going to step back into their space, throw them off balance, then drive your elbow back hard into their solar plexus. She moved through the motion slowly, carefully, her body pressing back against his as she followed his guidance. The professional demonstration had become something else entirely, a dance of awareness and proximity that had nothing to do with self-defense and everything to do with the way she trembled slightly when his breath touched her ear. Like this? She asked, and when she turned her head to look at him, their faces were inches apart. He should have stepped back, should have cleared his throat and moved on to the next technique. Instead, he found himself studying the curve of her lips, the way her dark eyes seemed to hold secrets he desperately wanted to discover. Perfect, he whispered, and the word carried weight that had nothing to do with her defensive technique. For a heartbeat, maybe two, they stayed frozen in that position, her body soft against his hands still resting on her shoulders, both of them breathing a little too fast for a simple training exercise. The professional mask he'd been wearing slipped completely, and he saw his own desire reflected in her eyes. Then, reality crashed back in, and he stepped away so quickly she stumbled slightly. That's good for today," he said, running a hand through his hair and trying to regain his composure. "We'll practice more tomorrow." She turned to face him fully, and he saw confusion mixed with something that looked like disappointment cross her features. "Nolan, I should check the perimeter," he interrupted, already moving toward the door. "Make sure everything's secure." He spent the next hour walking around her building, ostensibly checking security, but really trying to get his head straight. This was exactly the kind of complication he'd been hired to prevent, not create. Richard Kingsley was paying him to protect his daughter, not to complicate her life with unwanted attraction. But when he returned to the apartment and found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner for two without being asked, he realized his problem was bigger than simple physical attraction. The way she moved around her space, comfortable and natural, the way she'd automatically assumed he'd be staying for the meal. It felt domestic in a way that scared him more than any firefight he'd ever been in. "I hope you like pasta," she said without looking up from the stove. "I figured you probably don't get many home-cooked meals in your line of work." She was right. Most of his meals came from restaurants, takeout containers, or military mess halls. The idea of someone cooking for him, caring whether he ate well, it was more intimate than anything he'd experienced in years. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she interrupted, finally turning to look at him. "I want to. Is that allowed in whatever code of conduct you operate under?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to address directly, because they both knew she wasn't just talking about dinner. "Yeah," he said finally, "that's allowed." Over the next 3 weeks, moments like that became their new normal. Small intimacies that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with two people learning to exist in each other's space. The security arrangement meant he maintained a bedroom in her guest suite, close enough to respond to threats, far enough to maintain professional boundaries that were becoming harder to define each day. They fell into routines that felt dangerously like a relationship. Morning conversations over breakfast where she'd tell him about her dreams, literal ones, filled with colors and impossible landscapes that she'd try to recreate on canvas. Evening debriefs that turned into discussions about everything from books to philosophy to the way shadows change throughout the day. She was brilliant, he discovered. Not just talented, but genuinely intelligent in a way that made every conversation feel like an adventure. She could discuss the political implications of abstract expressionism with the same passion she brought to explaining why she preferred oil paints to acrylics, and he found himself looking forward to her insights on topics he'd never given much thought to. But it was the quiet moments that undid him completely. The way she'd absently touch his arm when she wanted his attention. How she'd curl up in the corner of her couch with a sketchbook, completely, unconscious of how beautiful she looked in the lamplight. The trust she showed by falling asleep during their movie nights, her head eventually finding its way to his shoulder as if it belonged there. He was falling for her, and falling hard. But every time he caught himself staring at her lips or imagining what it would be like to wake up next to her, Richard Kingsley's voice echoed in his mind. "I need someone I can trust absolutely." The man was paying him a fortune to protect his daughter, not seduce her. And Layla deserved better than a bodyguard who couldn't keep his feelings professional. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where doing the right thing felt like the hardest thing in the world? Where your heart wanted something your mind knew you couldn't have? Everything changed the night Scott Hill decided to make his most aggressive move yet. Nolan was reviewing security footage in Layla's home office when his phone buzzed with an alert from the gallery's security system. Multiple motion sensors triggered, cameras showing a figure moving through the building after hours, a figure who had no business being there. "Layla," he called, moving quickly toward the living room where she'd been reading. "We need to go, now." She looked up from her book, immediately alert. 3 weeks of working together had taught her to read his moods, and she could see this wasn't a drill. "What's wrong?" "Someone's in your gallery. We need to assume it's Hill and act accordingly." To her credit, she didn't argue or ask unnecessary questions. She grabbed her purse and jacket, slipped on shoes, and was ready to move in under 2 minutes. They took the service elevator to the parking garage, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back as he guided her toward his car. That's when they heard the footsteps echoing in the concrete space. "Get in the car," he told her quietly, pressing the keys into her hand. "If I'm not back in 5 minutes, drive to the police station." "Nolan, no. This isn't a discussion, Layla. Get in the car." The figure that emerged from behind a concrete pillar wasn't Scott Hill. It was one of his associates, a man Nolan recognized from the surveillance photos. Large, aggressive, with the kind of dead eyes that said he enjoyed causing pain. "Where is she?" the man demanded, pulling something from his jacket that glinted in the fluorescent lighting. Nolan moved to put himself between the threat and the car, his own weapon appearing in his hand with practiced ease. "Not your concern. Walk away." The man smiled, and it was the most unpleasant expression Nolan had ever seen. "Mr. Hill just wants to talk to her, explain how things are going to be." That's not happening. The confrontation was brief but intense. The attacker was strong but sloppy, relying on intimidation rather than skill. Nolan had disarmed him and had him face down on the concrete in under 30 seconds, but not before he'd managed to get a message across that made the bodyguard's blood run cold. "This was just a warning," the man wheezed as Nolan secured his hands with zip ties. "Mr. Hill knows where she lives, where she works, where she goes to feel safe. Next time, we won't be so polite." By the time the police arrived, Nolan had made a decision that would change everything. They couldn't stay at her apartment. It was compromised. They couldn't rely on predictable locations or routines. They needed to disappear for a while, go somewhere off the grid where he could keep her safe while they figured out their next move. "Where are we going?" Layla asked as he drove through the dark streets, taking a deliberately circuitous route to make sure they weren't being followed. "Safe house, remote location, secure communications, everything we need to wait this out while the police build their case against Hill." She was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "How long?" "Few days, maybe a week. Depends on what they find when they search his properties." "And you'll be there?" "The whole time?" There was something in her voice, not fear exactly, but awareness of what being isolated together would mean for the careful boundaries they'd been maintaining, the professional distance that was already hanging by a thread. "Yeah," he said, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "I'll be there." The safe house was a cabin nestled in the mountains 2 hours outside the city, rustic but well-equipped with security systems and communication equipment. It had been designed for exactly this type of situation, a place where a protection detail could hunker down with their client until a threat was neutralized. What it hadn't been designed for was the way his heart rate spiked when Layla emerged from the single bedroom wearing sleep clothes that showed just enough skin to drive him crazy, or how domestic it felt when they worked together to prepare meals in the small kitchen. The first night passed without incident, both of them maintaining careful politeness despite the charged atmosphere. But by the second day, the isolation and proximity were wearing down their defenses. "I should have brought more art supplies," she said, staring out the window at the forest that surrounded them. "I feel useless just sitting here." "You're staying alive," he reminded her. "That's not useless." She turned from the window, fixing him with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Is this what your life is like? Always looking over your shoulder, always ready to run?" "Sometimes." "Don't you get lonely?" The question hit closer to home than he was prepared for. Because yes, he got lonely. The job required a certain level of isolation, an ability to connect with people temporarily without forming lasting attachments. It was a life that had made sense until he met her. "I'm good at being alone," he said finally. "That's not what I asked." Before he could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, her phone rang. Richard Kingsley, checking in for the 3rd time that day. "Dad, I'm fine," she answered, but he could hear the strain in her voice. "Nolan has everything under control." He listened to her side of the conversation, noting how she reassured her father while downplaying the real danger they'd faced. She was protecting him as much as he was trying to protect her, and something about that dynamic made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. When she hung up, she looked exhausted. "He's terrified," she said softly. I can hear it in his voice. He's trying to hide it, but he's absolutely terrified that something's going to happen to me. He loves you, Nolan said simply. I know, but sometimes love feels like a cage. She settled onto the couch next to him, close enough that he could smell her shampoo. You understand that, don't you? The weight of being responsible for someone else's peace of mind? He understood it better than she knew, because watching her put herself at risk, seeing the fear in her eyes when that man had appeared in the garage, it had awakened something primal in him that went far beyond professional duty. Yeah, he said quietly, I understand. That's when she did something that shattered what remained of his professional composure. She reached over and took his hand, threading their fingers together with the kind of natural ease that suggested she'd been thinking about it as much as he had. Thank you, she said, for keeping me safe, for making this bearable, for being ... For being what? You, she finished simply, for being you. And sitting there in that small cabin, her hand warm in his while the fire crackled in the background, he realized that all his careful control was about to go up in flames. Chapter 3. The storm hit on their fourth night at the safe house with a vengeance that seemed designed to test every wall Nolan had built between duty and desire. Thunder shook the cabin's foundation as rain lashed against the windows, and when the power went out around midnight, he found himself fumbling through darkness toward the emergency supplies. 4 days of careful professional distance, 4 days of pretending that sharing this isolated space wasn't affecting him, 4 days of lying to himself about what he was feeling. All of it was about to crumble. Nolan, are you okay out there? Her voice called from the bedroom, smaller than usual. Generator's not kicking in, he called back, locating the battery-powered lanterns they'd need. Probably a fuel line issue. I'll get it sorted. When he made his way to the bedroom with the lantern, he found her sitting up in bed, arms wrapped around her knees. The soft light played across her face, highlighting the vulnerability she usually kept hidden beneath confidence and determination. I hate storms, she admitted, and the simple confession felt like a gift. Have since I was little. Mom used to let me sleep in her room when the weather got bad. Something twisted in his chest at the image, a small Layla seeking comfort from a mother who was no longer there to provide it. Before he could think better of it, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, lantern between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Tell me about her, he said softly. Her smile was sad but warm. She was an artist too, sculptor actually. Dad always said I got her hands and her heart. She held up her paint-stained fingers, studying them in the flickering light. She died when I was 16. Cancer. I'm sorry. She taught me that art wasn't about creating something beautiful. It was about creating something true, something that mattered, even if only to you. Layla's eyes found his in the semi-darkness. I think that's why I struggle so much with Dad's protection. It feels like living behind walls instead of living authentically. The thunder crashed again, closer this time, and she flinched despite herself. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his. You want to know something? He said. In all my years of protection work, I've never met anyone who lived more authentically than you. Even with everything that's happening, even with the restrictions and the fear, you're still completely yourself. She turned her hand over beneath his, palm to palm, and he felt something fundamental shift between them. What about you? Do you get to live authentically? The question pierced deeper than he was prepared for, because the honest answer was that he hadn't lived authentically in years. He'd built his entire adult life around duty, discipline, and emotional distance. He'd convinced himself that was enough, that personal connections were a luxury he couldn't afford. I used to think authentic living was a luxury, he said finally. Something that got in the way of doing what needed to be done. And now, sitting in the darkness with her hand warm in his, he was beginning to understand that maybe he'd had it backwards. Maybe authenticity wasn't a luxury. Maybe it was the only thing that made life worth living. Now I'm starting to think I might have been wrong about a lot of things. She shifted closer, close enough that he could feel her warmth, see the way the lantern light caught the gold flecks in her dark eyes. Like what? Like whether it's possible to do your job and follow your heart at the same time. The words hung between them, loaded with implications they'd been dancing around for weeks. He should have pulled back, should have remembered why those implications were dangerous. Instead, he found himself studying the curve of her lips, the way her breathing had quickened to match his. "Nolan," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer and a promise and a question all at once. "This is dangerous territory," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "More dangerous than men with weapons breaking into buildings?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, "much more dangerous, because bullets he could handle, threats he could neutralize." But the way she was looking at him, like he was something precious rather than just a hired protector, that was the kind of danger that could destroy everything he'd built his life around. "Why?" she asked, shifting even closer. "Why is this more dangerous?" "Because," he said, his thumb tracing across her knuckles almost without his permission. "When this is over, when Hill's arrested and you don't need protection anymore, I'll have to walk away. And if I let myself feel what I'm feeling right now, walking away might kill me." Her free hand came up to touch his face, fingers gentle against the stubble he hadn't bothered to shave. "What if I don't want you to walk away?" The storm outside chose that moment to unleash its full fury, and the sound of rain against the windows became a percussion that matched the wild beating of his heart. In the flickering lantern light, with her touch burning against his skin, every rational thought he'd ever had about professional boundaries disappeared. "Layla," he started, but she silenced him by leaning forward and pressing her forehead against his. "I know what you're going to say," she whispered, "about duty and propriety and all the reasons this is complicated. But I need you to know something. I've never felt safer than I do right here, right now, with you. Not because you're trained to protect me, but because of who you are when you think no one's watching." "Who am I when no one's watching?" "Kind, gentle, real." Her thumb traced his cheekbone, and he had to close his eyes against the intensity of her touch. "You think I don't notice the way you make sure there's always hot coffee ready when I get up? Or how you position yourself between me and every potential threat without even thinking about it? The way you listen when I talk about my art, like it actually matters to you?" It did matter to him. Everything about her mattered to him in ways that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "Your art is extraordinary," he said, opening his eyes to find her watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. "But it's not just the art. It's the passion behind it, the way you see beauty in things other people overlook, the way you make the ordinary feel magical just by caring about it." A tear slipped down her cheek, and before he could think better of it, he was brushing it away with his thumb. Her skin was soft, warm, impossibly real beneath his touch. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of the storm, of this, of how much I want this to be real instead of just circumstance and proximity." He understood completely, because he was terrified too. Terrified of how natural it felt to hold her, how right it seemed to be here with her in the darkness while the world raged outside. Terrified of how much he wanted to forget about contracts and professional distance and just be a man falling for an extraordinary woman. "It is real," he said, the admission feeling like jumping off a cliff. "At least, it is for me." Her smile was radiant, transforming her face in the lantern light. "Good," she whispered, "because I was starting to think I was losing my mind." And then she was kissing him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as he responded. Her lips were warm and sweet, and kissing her felt like coming home to a place he'd never known he was searching for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and tried to process what had just happened. He'd crossed a line he'd sworn he wouldn't cross, compromised his professional integrity in ways that would have horrified him a month ago, and he'd never felt more right about anything in his life. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never been in this situation before." She laughed softly, the sound like music in the darkness. "Well, that makes two of us." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the storm raged outside, both of them processing the magnitude of what had shifted between them. He knew there would be consequences, conversations with Richard that would be difficult at best, career implications he wasn't ready to consider, complications that would make everything harder. But for that moment, with Layla safe in his arms and her heartbeat steady against his, none of that mattered. For the first time in years, he was living authentically, following his heart instead of just his training. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like finally waking up. The next morning brought devastating news that would test everything they'd discovered in the darkness. His secure phone rang while Layla was still sleeping, and Ethan's voice on the other end carried a gravity that made his stomach drop. "We've got a problem, Nolan. A big one." He stepped outside onto the cabin's small porch, not wanting to wake her with whatever crisis was brewing. "Tell me." "Scott Hill's dead. Found him in his penthouse this morning. Single gunshot, looks professional." The implications hit him like a physical blow. If Scott Hill was dead, murdered execution style, then this wasn't just about an obsessed stalker anymore. This was about something much bigger, much more dangerous. "Any idea who's behind it?" he asked, his mind already racing through possibilities. "That's where it gets complicated," Ethan continued, his voice tight with worry. "Police found evidence that Hill was just the front man. Someone was paying him, funding his harassment campaign. Someone with serious money and serious connections." Nolan felt the blood drain from his face. "Any leads on who?" "That's the thing, Nolan. The evidence they found, it points back to Richard Kingsley." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What are you talking about?" "Financial records showing 2 different payment streams from Kingsley Industries," Ethan continued, his voice tight with worry. "Legitimate protection payments to your account through standard corporate channels and a separate set of payments to Hill through shell companies and offshore accounts." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Richard's insistence on complete protection, his need for someone he could trust absolutely, the generous compensation that had seemed too good to be true. Nolan wasn't just Layla's bodyguard. He was her father's unwitting accomplice in an elaborate scheme to control her life. "There's something else," Ethan said quietly. "They've issued a warrant for your arrest as an accessory. They think you've been feeding information back to Kingsley, helping him monitor his daughter." His legs nearly gave out. "Ethan, you know I would never—" "I know, but the evidence is compelling, and they're not interested in your word against financial records and communication logs. You need to bring her in, Nolan. Now, before this gets any worse." He ended the call and stood on that porch, staring out at the peaceful forest that had become a prison. Everything he thought he knew about this assignment, about Richard Kingsley, about his own role in this nightmare. It was all a lie. And Layla. God, Layla was inside that cabin, probably just waking up, believing she was safe with the man who was supposed to protect her, not knowing that her father had orchestrated her own psychological torture, that the bodyguard she'd fallen for was now a wanted fugitive. The sound of the door opening behind him made him turn. She stood in the doorway wearing one of his shirts over her sleep clothes, hair tousled from sleep, face soft with the kind of vulnerable happiness that comes from waking up knowing someone cares about you. "Good morning," she said, her smile faltering when she saw his expression. "What's wrong? How do you tell someone that their entire reality has just been shattered, that the father they love and trust has been manipulating them in the cruelest way possible? That the man they're falling for is now a suspect in a murder case?" "We need to talk," he said, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. Her face went pale, but she nodded and followed him back inside. He sat her down on the couch, taking her hands in his because he needed that connection, needed to feel that she was real even as everything else fell apart. "Scott Hill is dead," he said gently. "Murdered." She blinked, processing the information. That's terrible. I mean, he was awful to me, but I never wanted him dead. What happened?" "The police think it was a professional hit. Someone wanted him silenced." He took a deep breath, knowing the next words would destroy her. "Layla, they found evidence that suggests your father was paying Hill. that the whole stalking situation was orchestrated. The color drained from her face completely. What are you saying? I'm saying it looks like Richard set up the entire threat so he could justify keeping you under constant surveillance. Hill wasn't acting alone. He was being paid to terrorize you. She pulled her hands from his, standing up abruptly and backing away from him. No, that's not possible. My father loves me. He would never. I know it doesn't make sense. I know how much he cares about you. But the evidence can be fabricated, she said, her voice rising with desperation. Someone's trying to frame him, to make it look like... She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening with sudden terrible understanding. They think you were involved, don't they? They think you were helping him. He nodded, hating the way she flinched as if he'd struck her. There's a warrant out for my arrest. They believe I was feeding information back to Richard, helping him monitor your activities. Were you? The question was barely a whisper, but it cut deeper than any blade. No. He stood up, desperate to make her understand. Layla, I swear to you I had no idea. I thought I was protecting you from a genuine threat. Everything I've told you, everything that's happened between us. It's real. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. How do I know what's real anymore? How do I know you're not just another part of his plan? The question broke something inside him, because he understood exactly why she had to ask it. From her perspective, everyone she'd trusted had betrayed her. Her father, the man who was supposed to love her unconditionally, had orchestrated her psychological torture, and him, the man she had opened her heart to, was now a suspect in a murder case. Because, he said, moving closer despite the way she tensed, if I was part of his plan, do you think he would have wanted this to happen? He gestured between them, the intimate space they'd created, the emotional connection that had nothing to do with duty or surveillance. Do you think he would have wanted me to fall in love with you? The words hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. It was the first time either of them had used that word, and under any other circumstances, it would have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it felt like a confession made in the ruins of everything they'd thought they understood. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and he wanted nothing more than to hold her, to comfort her, to promise that everything would be okay. But he couldn't make that promise, and she was looking at him like he was a stranger who'd somehow infiltrated her most vulnerable moments. I need to think, she said, moving toward the bedroom. I can't do this right now. He let her go, knowing that pushing would only make things worse. But as he watched her close the bedroom door between them, he felt something precious and fragile shatter in his chest. Have you ever had to watch someone you love discover that their entire world was built on lies? Have you ever been helpless to comfort them because you might be part of the deception? Chapter 4. The next several hours were torture. Layla stayed in the bedroom while Nolan paced the small living space, trying to figure out their next move. They'd been at the safe house for 4 days now, and what had started as a simple protective measure had become something much more complex, both emotionally and legally. His secure phone rang again around noon. Richard Kingsley's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment he was tempted to ignore it. But he needed answers, needed to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Mr. Prescott, Richard's voice was strained, desperate. Thank God. Are you and Layla safe? Are we? Nolan asked coldly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the biggest threat to your daughter's safety might be you. Silence on the other end, then a sound that might have been a sob. I know Scott Hill is dead. I know the police found financial records linking you to him. I know there's a warrant out for my arrest. What I don't know is why a father would terrorize his own daughter. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Richard said, his voice breaking. Hill was supposed to be manageable, controllable, just enough of a threat to justify protection, to keep her close, to keep her safe from real dangers. What real dangers? Nolan demanded. My business partners, Nolan, the real estate deals, the construction contracts. I've had to work with some dangerous people over the years to build my empire, men who would hurt her just to send me a message. 3 years ago, I received direct threats against Layla from a competitor I'd outbid on a major project. That's when I realized she needed protection, but she's so stubborn, so independent. She would never accept it unless she believed she needed it. The twisted logic was starting to make sense, and somehow that made it even more horrifying. So, you hired Hill to create a manageable threat, something she'd take seriously, but not something that would actually harm her. Exactly. Hill was supposed to be persistent but harmless, annoying flowers, showing up at public events, the kind of behavior that would justify security but never escalate to real danger. But he got greedy, started doing things I never authorized, real threats following her home, making her genuinely afraid instead of just cautious. So you had him killed? I had him stopped. Richard's voice cracked with emotion. He was going to destroy her, make her hate me, ruin everything I was trying to protect her from. I couldn't let that happen. Nolan sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by the scope of his betrayal. This man who claimed to love his daughter had orchestrated an elaborate psychological torture campaign, then committed murder to cover it up. She knows, he said quietly. About Hill, about the payments, about the manipulation. She knows Richard. The sound Richard made was pure anguish. How is she? Can I talk to her? Before Nolan could answer, the bedroom door opened and Layla emerged. She'd been crying, but her eyes were clear, determined. She'd made some kind of decision. Is that him? She asked, gesturing to the phone. Nolan nodded and she held out her hand. Let me talk to him. He hesitated, knowing this conversation would be devastating for both of them. But it was her choice to make, her pain to process however she needed to. Layla, Richard's voice was thick with tears when she took the phone. Sweetheart, I can explain. No, she said, her voice steady despite the tears still flowing down her cheeks. You can't explain this. There is no explanation that makes this okay. Nolan could hear Richard's voice through the speaker, pleading, desperate, but Layla's expression remained resolute. You made me afraid of shadows, she continued. You made me doubt my own instincts, question my own judgment. You made me feel like I needed to be saved when the only thing I needed saving from was you. I was trying to protect you. By torturing me? By hiring someone to make me feel unsafe in my own life? Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How many nights I lay awake wondering if I was losing my mind, if I was overreacting, if I was too weak to handle a simple stalker. Layla, please. And Nolan, she said, looking directly at him as she spoke, you dragged him into this, made him complicit in your lies. You turned him into a suspect in a murder case because you couldn't handle the fact that your adult daughter might want to live her own life. I love you, Richard whispered, and even through the phone, Nolan could hear his heart breaking. I know you do, Layla said, her own voice softening slightly. But love doesn't justify what you've done. Love doesn't make it okay to control someone through fear and manipulation. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Nolan, then collapsed onto the couch as if the conversation had drained every ounce of her strength. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. She looked at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. The worst part is, I understand why he did it. In his twisted way, he really thought he was protecting me. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less. What do you want to do now? She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the forest that had become their temporary sanctuary. I want to turn ourselves in. I want to tell the police everything we know, everything that happened. I want to face this honestly, even if it destroys everything. Nolan nodded, knowing she was right, even though the idea terrified him. It's going to be complicated. They'll want to know about our relationship, about what happened between us. Let them know, she said, turning to look at him with an expression that made his heart skip. I'm not ashamed of falling for you, Nolan. Even if it all started with lies, what we found together, that's real. That's the one true thing in this whole mess. And sitting there in that small cabin, knowing they were about to walk into a storm that might destroy both their lives, He realized that she was absolutely right. Everything else might have been built on lies and manipulation, but what they'd discovered in the darkness, that was worth fighting for. That was worth risking everything for. Have you ever decided to walk into certain pain because staying in comfortable lies would be worse? Have you ever chosen the hard truth over the easy deception? The drive back to the city felt like traveling toward their own execution, but Layla sat beside him with a calm determination that amazed him. She'd found her strength in the midst of devastation, chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over safety. "Are you scared?" she asked as the city skyline came into view. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of the police or the charges. I'm scared of losing you." She reached over and took his hand, threading their fingers together with the same natural ease that had undone him in the cabin. "You're not going to lose me. Whatever happens next, whatever we have to face, we're facing it together." The police station was a maze of fluorescent lights and hostile stares, but Layla never let go of his hand as they surrendered themselves to Detective Sarah Chen, the lead investigator on the Hill murder case. "Ms. Kingsley," Detective Chen said as they sat in the sterile interview room, "we need to know everything about your relationship with Mr. Prescott, about your father's arrangement, about what you knew and when you knew it." For the next 6 hours, they told their story. Every detail, every moment, every feeling that had developed between them. Layla spoke with unflinching honesty about her father's overprotection, about the fear Hill had instilled in her, about the way Nolan's presence had made her feel safe for the first time in months. Nolan testified about his growing suspicions that something wasn't right, about the moments when Richard's behavior seemed off, about his own failure to recognize the signs that he was being used. But most importantly, they both spoke about the night in the cabin when everything had changed between them, about the authenticity they'd found in each other's arms, about the love that had grown despite the lies surrounding them. "Mr. Prescott," Detective Chen said during one of their breaks, "your story checks out. Financial records clearly distinguish between legitimate protection payments and the illegal funding of Hill's harassment campaign. Communication logs confirm you had no knowledge of the arrangement with Hill." Relief flooded through him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that clearing his name was only the beginning. Richard was in custody, facing charges for conspiracy and murder. Layla's world had been shattered by the revelation that her father's love had manifested as control and deception. "What happens now?" Nolan asked. "Now you're free to go, both of you." Detective Chen's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I believe your story. Sometimes good people get caught up in other people's lies." Walking out of that police station with Layla felt like emerging from a nightmare into uncertain daylight. They stood on the steps, breathing free air and trying to process everything that had happened. "Where do we go from here?" Layla asked, and he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Wherever you want," he said simply. "Your life is your own now. No one controlling it, no one making decisions for you. What do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city that had become both prison and home. "I want to go to my studio," she said finally. "I want to paint. I want to create something true out of all this chaos." Chapter 5. Her studio in the warehouse district had become a crime scene during the investigation, but the police had released it back to her that morning. As they walked through the door, Nolan saw her shoulders relax for the first time in days. This was her sanctuary, her place of authentic expression. "Will you stay?" she asked, moving toward her easel with purposeful steps. "While I work?" "If you want me to." "I want you to," she said, already reaching for her brushes. "Not because I need protection, but because I want you here. Because you're part of my truth now." He settled into the chair he'd occupied during those first tentative days of their relationship. But everything was different now. There was no pretense of professional distance, no careful boundaries to maintain. There was just Layla, painting with fierce concentration, and him watching her create beauty from pain. "What are you painting?" he asked after she'd been working in focused silence for an hour. She stepped back from the canvas, brush still in hand, paint streaking her fingers and forearms. Us, she said simply, that night in the cabin, the moment when everything changed. He moved closer to see her work, and his breath caught. The painting was abstract but unmistakably intimate, warm colors bleeding into each other, forms that suggested two people finding each other in darkness, light breaking through storm clouds. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. "It's honest," she replied, which somehow meant more. She set down her brush and turned to face him, paint still wet on her hands, vulnerability and strength warring in her expression. "Nolan, I need to know something. Anything. If my father hadn't orchestrated this whole situation, if we'd met under normal circumstances, do you think we still would have found each other?" He thought about it seriously, considering the woman she was beneath all the circumstances that had brought them together. Her passion, her authenticity, her fierce independence, the way she saw beauty in shadows and found strength in vulnerability. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Maybe not as quickly, maybe not as intensely, but yes. What we have, it's not about proximity or circumstances or shared trauma. It's about recognition." Recognition. The way you see me. Not as a protector or a professional or someone playing a role, but as myself. The way I see you, not as a client or a responsibility, but as this extraordinary woman who makes the world brighter just by being in it. Tears gathered in her eyes, but they were different from the ones she'd shed over her father's betrayal. These were tears of relief, of possibility, of hope. "I love you," she said, the words simple and direct and devastating in their honesty. "Not because you saved me, but because you saw me, really saw me." "I love you too," he replied, moving closer until he could touch her face, paint smudging between them. "For your courage, your passion, the way you choose truth even when it hurts." And then she was kissing him, paint-stained hands framing his face, her body warm and real against his. This kiss was different from the one they'd shared in the cabin, less desperate, more certain. It tasted of new beginnings and authentic choices, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure rather than breaking. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his and smiled. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure it out together," he said. "No contracts, no arrangements, no one else's agenda. Just us making choices based on what we want, what we feel, what we believe is right." "That's terrifying," she said. "Yeah," he agreed, "it is. And wonderful." "Yeah, that too." Over the following weeks, they built something entirely new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The investigation took 2 months to complete, with Richard's trial beginning in early spring. Layla testified with painful honesty about the psychological impact of his manipulations, while also expressing her hope that he could find redemption through accountability. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with Richard ultimately pleading guilty to conspiracy and second-degree murder charges. He was sentenced to 15 years, with the possibility of parole in 8 if he continued his therapy and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. Nolan started his own security consulting firm during this period, focusing on protecting people who chose his services rather than having them imposed upon them. The distinction mattered more than he'd ever realized. She had her first solo exhibition 8 months after Richard's sentencing, and standing in that gallery surrounded by her paintings, including the one of their night in the cabin, he felt pride that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment and everything to do with witnessing someone bloom into their fullest authenticity. "See that painting?" she said, pointing to a vibrant canvas near the center of the gallery, "the one with all the broken chains turning into birds?" He nodded, studying the powerful image of transformation and freedom. "That's what you gave me," she said softly. "Not protection from the world, but the courage to break free from the things that were actually holding me captive." "You did that yourself," he corrected. "I just had the privilege of watching." "We did it together," she said, taking his hand in hers with the easy familiarity that had become their greatest joy. The most important kind of protection isn't keeping someone safe from the world. It's creating a space where they feel safe enough to be themselves. Looking around that gallery filled with her art, with people celebrating her vision and talent, he understood that she was absolutely right. Real protection wasn't about building walls or maintaining distance. It was about creating trust deep enough to allow vulnerability, love strong enough to encourage, authenticity. Richard was serving his sentence, but he'd also been getting therapy, working to understand how his legitimate fears about business enemies had twisted into psychological manipulation of his own daughter. Layla visited him occasionally, not to forgive, that would take time, but to maintain hope that people could change, that love could be expressed more healthily. "Do you think he'll ever really understand what he did?" Nolan asked her after one of those visits. "I think he's trying," she said. "And that's all anyone can do, try to be better than they were yesterday." 10 months after that stormy night in the cabin, Nolan asked Layla to marry him. Not in a grand gesture or romantic setting, but in her studio while she painted, surrounded by the tools of her authentic expression. "Yes," she said without hesitation, paint still wet on her hands as she pulled him close. "Yes, but not because I need someone to take care of me." "Why then?" "Because I want to take care of you too, because I want to build something real with someone who sees me clearly and loves me anyway." Their wedding was small, intimate, filled with people who celebrated authentic love over comfortable illusions. Paige was Layla's maid of honor, and Ethan stood as Nolan's best man. Even Kelly Marwood attended, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who'd recognized true love before the lovers themselves had figured it out. As they exchanged vows in the garden behind the gallery where they'd first met, Nolan thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with deception, manipulation, and carefully constructed lies. But from that poisoned soil, something beautiful and true had managed to grow. "I promise," Layla said, her voice clear and strong as she spoke her vows, "to love you not because you make me feel safe, but because you make me feel free to be myself completely." "I promise," he replied, "to protect what matters most, not your body, but your spirit. Not your safety, but your authenticity. Not your compliance, but your choices." And as they kissed to seal their promises, surrounded by friends and family who'd witnessed their transformation from client and protector to partners in the truest sense, he understood that sometimes the most valuable things grow from the most unlikely soil. Money couldn't buy what they'd found together, contracts couldn't contain it, professional distance couldn't diminish it. Because authentic love, the kind that sees clearly and chooses consciously, is the one thing that grows stronger when tested, deeper when challenged, more beautiful when freed from the constraints others try to impose. Richard Kingsley had paid him to protect his daughter from other men, but no amount of money could have stopped Nolan from falling for her. Because some connections transcend arrangement, some bonds exist beyond contract, and some love is worth risking everything to pursue. In the end, the greatest protection he could offer Layla wasn't his training or his vigilance. It was his promise to love her exactly as she was, to support her dreams without trying to control them, and to choose her freely every single day for the rest of their lives. Have you ever discovered that the most dangerous thing wasn't what you were protecting yourself from, but what you were protecting yourself from feeling? Sometimes the greatest risk is opening your heart, but it's also the greatest reward. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with authentic love, the kind that sees past circumstances to the truth underneath. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if Layla and Nolan's journey resonated with you, and make sure you're subscribed for more stories that celebrate the beautiful complexity of human connection. Until tomorrow, remember that the love worth having is the love that sets you free to be exactly who you're meant to be. And sometimes, the person paid to protect you becomes the person who helps you discover your own strength. Subscribe now and join thousands of beautiful hearts in our Dear Love Diaries family, where every story reminds us that authentic love is always worth the risk.